Welcome everybody to this webinar organized by EURO-NMD in collaboration with the European Reference Network for Rare Neurological Disorders and the European Academy of Neurology. The invitee today is Professor Michelangelo Mancuso from Pisa University Hospital, and is going to talk about management of fatigue in myopathies. Professor Mancuso is a specialist in neurology, graduated in medicine in Pisa, and had training also in Columbia University in New York. And in 2004, he obtained his PhD at the University of Pisa. His main interests are neuromuscular and genetic diseases, including mitochondrial disorders, although he has extensive experience in diagnosis and treatment of rare diseases. He's currently working as an associate professor of neurology at the University of Pisa, and since 2013 is the physician in charge of the outpatient neurogenetics service of the neurological clinic of the Azienda Ospedaliera Universitaria Pisana. Is member of several scientific societies, author of a great number of publications, and organized and participated in also a great number of national and international congresses. Is the past coordinator of the study group of clinical neurogenetics and rare disorders of the Italian Society of Neurology, and coordinator of the rare diseases coordinating panel of the European Academy of Neurology. Is the chairman of the mitochondrial group of the EURO-NMD in co-chair with Professor Cornelia Kornblum, and is also coordinating the new inter-ERN group for the study of mitochondrial diseases, including EURO-NMD, rare neurological disorders, epicare, eye, and metaverse. So without further ado, please, Michelangelo, the floor is entirely yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio, for the introduction, and I'm very happy to have a new webinar for the EURO-NMD. I was frequently involved in a webinar mainly discussing about different aspects of mitochondrial diseases. And so when Marianne de Visser asked me to cover the topic on fatigue, I say, yes, why not? And then by the time the webinar was approaching, I start realizing that this is a very complicated webinar to deliver, because at the end, I hope you will get the same conclusion that I reached by preparing this webinar. We still know very little about fatigue, starting from the definition, going through the biomarkers, outcome measures, clinical functional tests, and so on. So it's a broad chapter of medicine. As you all know, fatigue is one of the most common symptoms, not only in neurology, but I guess in medicine in general. There are multiple studies, including epidemiological studies based on primary care community, studies that have estimated an overall prevalence of fatigue within population up to 45%, and up to 10% of the people frequently report fatigue lasting at least 6 months. So it's quite important. And the impact of fatigue increase with the age, and also it is not necessarily related to a neurological condition, to a neuromuscular condition as expected, but it's a very common manifestation in multiple, as I said, area of medicine, including cancer, cardiovascular diseases, etc. But beside the huge impact of fatigue in our clinical practice, we still have a lot of issues. We don't really clearly know yet the pathophysiology of fatigue. Even the definition, the term of fatigue is used. If you all go through the literature, you will find dozens of different definitions of fatigue. There is not a universal standard definition or a universal means of measurement of fatigue, no matter if we are talking about a patient with neurological diseases, but the same is in every different sectors of medicine. So what is fatigue is already a big question, because the perception of fatigue is subjective. First of all, as I said, we don't have an exact definition. For sure, we know that fatigue is one thing. It's not the same of muscle weakness. It's not the depression. It's not muscle fatigability per se. It's definitely an overwhelming, sustained sense of exhaustion and decreased capacity for both physical and mental work. Usually the patient, when experience fatigue, is not able to perform physically or mentally or both at the usual level. So for a clinical use, fatigue is probably the best way to define fatigue is the difficulty of initiate or sustain a voluntary activity. So through the PubMed, if I was enjoying this exercise together with Sarah, who is a resident working with us here in Pisa, who helped me developing this presentation. If you go through the PubMed or you ask ChatGPT, the definition of muscle fatigue is quite intriguing and changing from one publication to another. So we may define fatigue as a multifactorial of complex phenomenon defined by the inability to maintain an expected level of force during muscular contraction over time. We may consider, we may define fatigue any kind of decline in the capacity of our neuromuscular system to generate force irrespective of the expected force level. But definitely one, I think, of the main article that was published in the field, and this is from Denver University in the States back in almost 15 years ago now. With this paper, I think is very interesting and very important to be read by everybody, with Professor Kluger in 2013 proposing a new taxonomy that divides the concept of fatigue into mainly in two dimensions, right? The performance fatigue, like, an objective measure of the decline in performance over time, over a given period of exercise, of exertion, and perceived fatigue, which include all the subjective sensations that are affecting the person, the patient, homeostasis, and is considered as a complex entity involving both central and peripheral nervous system, as well as additional metabolic changes, and not less important, also psychological and psychosomatic and psychiatric components, right? So there were a lot of studies, mainly, of course, in animal models, that have identified multiple factors that are able to influence the perception of fatigue or fatigability. So when we discuss about this factor, we should always distinguish those that can influence the perception of fatigue and fatigability, and then identify the relevant factor for each of them. We know that, for instance, again from animal models, that the hypothalamus contribute to the energy regulation and also fatigue perception, and as hypothalamus does in other activity, like being angry, being thirsty. But the hypothalamus, of course, is not the only character here. We have other brain areas, including the basal ganglia, the frontal lobes, that are also most likely important in regulating all the behavioral changes and other tools, right? So definitely we should have a central nervous system acting as a sort of central governor to limit energy utilization and avoid the energetic crisis collapse, right? But also when we talk about the muscle fatigue, definitely factors contributing to peripheral fatigue are a multi-level. We definitely need to consider the depletion of energy in terms of glycogen storage, but also ATP depletion or electron transport chain impairments that at the end cause ATP depletion, ROS accumulation, and they all can manifest with fatigue. Right, so multiple different ways, and the origin of fatigue, if we now start focusing on neurological conditions, the origin of fatigue are definitely explained by several interplaying factors, right? In general, I would say a distinction that has to be performed is between primary and secondary fatigue. Primary fatigue is, more or less defined in the literature as something directly linked to the pathological process underlying the neurological disease, while secondary fatigue is linked to the different either comorbidities or psychosocial implication that a specific disease, a specific neurological, neuromuscular disease implies, like if you think about, the occurrence of sleep impairment or physical deconditioning that most of the patient will develop, respiratory failure, cardiac insufficiency, nutritional imbalance, and then of course depression, anxiety, all the psychopathological mechanisms that are usually associated with multiple neurological and muscular diseases. So it's a very complex scenario where at the end we create a vicious circle. Basically, once you start having fatigue and other eventual symptom of neuromuscular involvement, you start having inactivity, the quality of life deteriorates, you have the muscle deconditioning, you have mood disorder, and everything goes back to the sense of fatigue. But focusing on our neuromuscular diseases, I would say all our neuromuscular disease may present fatigue as a clinical entity. And I don't know if you are aware about this very recent study that we have developed into the EURO-NMD. We were basically interviewing patients with all neuromuscular diseases that are covered by our ERN, and we have got answers from almost 1,400 patients across Europe. We analyzed 1109 answered because other answers were not either complete or with insufficient data. And what we have realized across all neuromuscular diseases, that the most bothersome symptoms that you see on the right side of the slide are, as expected, muscle weakness, impaired physical function activity. And then we have, almost 20% of the patient will manifest as one of the most bothersome symptoms, muscular fatigue, but you also have mental fatigue a little bit below. So this publication that is now available on the Orphanet Journal clearly demonstrates that fatigue is one of the most bothersome symptoms across all neuromuscular diseases that we are used to deal with in our ERN. So going to more details, of course, depending on the disease, the pathomechanism and the feature of fatigue may be different, because depending on the primary etiology, we may have prevalent central fatigue or peripheral fatigue or mixed fatigue, really depending on the system, on the affected systems and on the metabolic changes that the disease cause to the neuromuscular system. I mean, I'm not going to through all these different conditions. Just to give you an example, that, for instance, in myotonic dystrophy type 1, definitely the brain involvement plus the depressed mood, the impairment of the sleep, lead to chronic fatigue in this patient that is central, but is also peripheral because of the muscle wasting and the muscle weakness. If we think about mitochondrial diseases, for instance, the primary mitochondrial myopathy here, we definitely have as a primum movens the deficiency of the OXPHOS. We don't breathe correctly into the mitochondrion. We have ATP depletion, we have ROS accumulation, but because mitochondrial disorders are multisystemic, we don't have usually only skeletal muscle involvement, but we have also respiratory involvement, we may have cardiomyopathy, encephalopathy. So the predominant fatigue in PMM usually is both peripheral and central fatigue because of the exopathogenesis of the underlying disorder. Just to give you more data on one of these neuromuscular disorder and fatigue, most of you, I guess, are familiar with primary mitochondrial diseases that may affect any age, any organ, as I said already, and therefore the clinical manifestation is quite broad, ranging from infantile severe encephalopathy to myopathy phenotype even in after 50, 60 years of age. Another complexity of this chapter of medicine is that we have hundreds of different genes that are encoded either in the mitochondrial DNA or the majority in the nuclear DNA. So the genotype phenotype is quite complex. And the same is true for the inheritance and the clinical presentation of those disorders. So one of the most important mitochondrial myopathy, which belong to the activity of our EURO-NMD, is definitely the primary mitochondrial myopathy. These PMM are genetically determined mitochondrial diseases with prominent skeletal muscle involvement. We have two major phenotypes depending on the presence or absence of progressive external ophthalmoplegia. And the diagnostic criteria and outcome measures were recently published as an EMC workshop as an activity of our EURO-NMD mitochondrial working group. So if we think about the clinical presentation, one of the most prominent clinical manifestation is definitely exercise intolerance with fatigue. Most of the patients with PMM will have both fatigue and exercise intolerance. This, for instance, was an historical paper, I would say now, back in 2012 from the Italian Network Mitochondrial Diseases that was analyzing almost 1,000 patients with mitochondrial disease and fatigue and exercise intolerance were constantly, not constantly, were the three most prevalent signs into our population. There was a certain also correlation between some genotypes and phenotypes. And even more recently, again, the Italian group was evaluating outcome measures and also PROMs. I will go back to PROMs outcome measures later during our webinar. And you clearly see that by applying the fatigue severity scale as an outcome, as a PROM in our 118 Italian patient with PMM, you clearly see that fatigue severity scale is constantly above 10 in our mitochondrial patients. The reference value is below 2, just to give you an idea. So patients with mitochondrial myopathy experience severe fatigue, which correlates quite well also with other functional outcome measures. I don't have time to go into the details, but it's a very classic constant manifestation. And then we were also monitoring the patient over time. And this is the results at 12 months follow-up. You clearly see that within 12 months, mitochondrial myopathy, the decline or functional performances in PMM is quite very slowly progressive. Within 1 year, you don't observe any difference between in terms of perception of fatigue. Actually, fatigue is not surprising. It's more present, is more severe in patients with limb girdle and skeletal muscle involvement compared to the fatigue experienced by patient with only progressive external ophthalmoplegia, but this is something that was expected, right? So how to measure now fatigue? So we have a sort of definition. We are understanding a little bit better the pathomechanism behind the contribution of the central nervous system on the peripheral central system, but the assessment of both the perceived and the performance related dimension of fatigue is also crucial, right? Also considering that it is not obvious, obvious to recognize a good association between the two different fatigue, the perceived and the performance related, right? And in nowadays, fatigue is becoming more and more important also in terms of how to catch it and how to measure fatigue, because it's becoming more and more important also in clinical trials. When most of you may have experience in interventional clinical trials in myopathies, and now both FDA and EMA consider extremely important also as a primary or secondary endpoint fatigue. So we need to clearly have an idea how to measure fatigue and which are the best outcome measures to deal with this specific symptom. Well, unfortunately, I have to say that we don't really have a lot of biomarkers that can be used in daily practice. At least we have a lot of different ways to measure fatigue, but in the majority of the cases, these measures or these biomarkers that I'm going to touch very briefly are not really part of clinical daily life, are more used in research settings. But anyway, we may now have a different approach to quantify the fatigue. For instance, the maximal voluntary contraction is a mechanical approach that can easily quantify the overall fatigue. We may also, and I will go back to this, use the surface EMG is quite interesting application. In terms of circulating biomarkers, unfortunately, we almost have nothing. I mean, we can monitor blood lactate, pyruvate, ammonia, basally, and the response to the exercise, but it's not very sensitive. It's not specific at all. We may study the oxygenation through the near infrared spectroscopy and the difference between oxy and the oxyhemoglobin. But as I said, in clinical daily practice, we don't really have a lot. Interesting is also the use of P31 magnetic resonance spectroscopy, where you can clearly quantify phosphocreatine, phosphoinositol, you can monitor the pH, but all these parameters are not really into the daily practice. I would spend one more word on the surface EMG, because this is quite interesting. Nowadays is something that has been used more and more. And this, for instance, is a nice exercise that was performed in Nijmegen with Nicole Voigt and Miriam Jansen. They were studying 32 patient comparing the data with the sorry, with the healthy controls. So they were doing the cardiopulmonary exercise testing, and they were recording surface EMG from the leg muscles. And what they observed, there was a clear correlation between the ventilatory thresholds and the EMG threshold. But more interestingly, compared to controls, the surface EMG threshold occurred much earlier compared to the ventilatory threshold. So I would encourage mainly the new generation to explore more in detail this technique to quantify the fatigue. So Francesca Torri from our team was exploring again, and this is quite interesting, a recent article where you can get more data, not only on pathophysiology that I was already trying to explain you, but on the most used outcome measures and patient-reported outcome measures in the field of muscle fatigue. So she went through the literature. So in this article, you can have a comprehensive list of outcome measures that we can use. I'm going to just mention, because it's quite popular, the 6-minute walk test. The 6-minute walk test, it could be used as a good outcome measure to quantify the muscle fatigue. And this, for instance, was what we have done in our PMM patients. We were just collecting every minute the meters the patient was walking 1 minute after the other, and you clearly observe that there is a significant slope between the first and the 6 minutes during the outcome measure performance, which reflects probably the muscle fatigue in our PMM population. So this could also be interesting to use. Then focusing a little bit more on patient-reported outcome measures for those who are not really into this. Prompts deal with the aspect of health that cannot be observed objectively. It cannot be measured by the physician. Yeah, for instance, how do you act at work? How do you? What about housekeeping, sport, social life, and etc. So there are hundreds of prompts available, including for fatigue. There are a lot of good questionnaires that were validated in different studies. This is an example of prompts that you can use regarding fatigue. I'm very confident. I've daily use the fatigue severity scale. I think is quite reliable, but also the modified fatigue impact scale is another good questionnaire. But at the end, we are going to quantify fatigue. We need to quantify fatigue with either clinical outcomes or prompts or through registries, because are more and more important in terms of regulatory agencies. As I told you, we need to better know and better catch symptoms in general, but fatigue in particular. So we may take advantage of the new technologies. All of us are now surrounded by algorithms, machine learning, digital health technologies, and they are a little by little jumping into also our daily life practice in the neuromuscular field, right? So this was a recent review that was published exploring how artificial intelligence and digital health technologies are currently used in terms of interventional, observational, or registry studies in neurology. You clearly see that the amount of studies that are registered in clinicaltrials.gov are growing a lot, and in the very past few years, now we are using more and more digital health technologies to explore motor tracking, cognition, speech, swallowing, the sleep tracking, and so on. So definitely we should take advantage of these new technologies, because definitely for the clinical care, they will be extremely useful to improve the efficiency and the efficacy of our ability to manage neuromuscular patients, right? Not only because most likely all these new algorithms will help us in reaching an earlier diagnosis, but probably we will use a lot of these new techniques also to motivate and engage patients in their care, in their environment. In this scenario, a very important question that we are now facing, and we need to start thinking about this, is can really patient generate health data from wearables, sensors, apps, device? Can this data really supplement or even replace the study visits or the traditional way we were used to collect data from patients? So we are going to have a lot of digital biomarkers in the future, and we need to take this seriously into account. And regarding prompts, now we are shifting from paper prompts. We were used to use all this paper that the patient in front of us has to fill, has to spend the 5, 10, 15 minutes. It's very boring. We don't have time. The patient, we have a few minutes for each patient, so it's complicated. But moving into the electronic prompts now, it has already been demonstrated, at least in the oncological field, that using electronic prompts increase the completion rate. The patient can perform anytime in a computer, in a specific app, the requested prompts. The prompts will flow directly into the doctor files. We don't need to print them out. We don't have to give a paper to the doctor that has to transfer in the electronic notes. It is easy now to remind patients to participate in the prompts activities, for instance, with pop-up coming out on your laptop, on your mobile phone, etc. So definitely the electronic prompts are becoming more and more used in not only in trials, but also in clinical care. This Lancet Digital Health article was extremely interesting, in my opinion, back in it's 2022, so it's not really old. In this meta-analysis, the authors were analyzing how many, in clinicaltrials.gov, how many interventional studies having health technology on board were running with or without prompts collected as a primary or secondary endpoints. And it's complicated to read, but what you clearly see, the blue bar are the prompts. So despite the new algorithms, they can elaborate signals, they can get trajectories, a lot of data. Prompts are still extremely important in clinical trials, in observational studies, because algorithms cannot really get into the patient mood, into the patient daily life. And so only the prompts and the patient perspective will remain central. Also, now that we are going to use more and more artificial intelligence and new digital tools. So we definitely need prompts in neuromuscular diseases. I don't want to spend too much time here. There are nice reviews. This one, again, from the group of Nijmegen, was stressing the importance of identify not only the good prompts, but to try to have specific prompts for the specific neuromuscular symptoms. This is one of the reasons why in our year-end work package 7, we are now developing several tools focusing on prompts, and also we are trying to develop an app for patients with neuromuscular disease. And this is important because, as you know, all our neuromuscular diseases are either genetics or probably inflammatory, immune, or degenerative diseases. But despite a clear pathogenic cascade. The phenotypic expression of our patient most of the time is also influenced by the exposome, by the environment. So genetics can provide a lot of information, but the phenotype expression, the disease, is not entirely caused by the genetics, but there is a lot of metabolomics, exposomics data that are influenced also by the environment. And one of the big changes that are ongoing now is to try to catch, for instance, pain or fatigue triggers by analyzing not only the prompts from the patient, but also all this exposome data that our smartphone, our watch, our smart band already collected, like pollution, temperature, pressure, heart rate, etc. So it is becoming more and more important not only to analyze prompts, but also try to get more information from the environmental triggers, mainly for pain and fatigue. And this is the app we are building together with the EURO-NMD. It's called PROMI. It will be available soon, hopefully. We are going to collate in this app the most bothersome symptoms, so the patient will get a message like this: how do you feel today? If the patient doesn't feel okay, we will have the different bothersome symptoms that we have already collected through the Orphanet Journal article. The patient will answer how severe is fatigue, weakness, etc., and the specific prompts will also be filled by the patient through the app. So in extremely complex scenario in evolution, I would say. And what about then the management? We have actually two main approach to our muscle fatigue. First of all, the physical activity is extremely important. We do have now strong evidence that physical activity has definitely a positive impact on physical and mental health, quality of life, prevention and management of several chronic diseases, not necessarily the neuromuscular diseases, but people with pathologies, including neuromuscular diseases, are definitely at greater risk of physical inactivity and sedentary life. Therefore, physical inactivity in neuromuscular disease leads to the muscle deconditioning, and as I said at the very beginning, in turn worsen health and physical function, and also accelerate the primary disease process. So we definitely need to work on physical exercise as defined as a correct subset of physical activities that should be planned, structured, and overseen by experts, because cannot be just learn how to exercise through the ChatGPT. We really need, if we have the patient with a neuromuscular disease, to have good advice. We need to keep in mind that we always need to start low, go slow. One size does not fit all. Not all patients will benefit of the same exercise program. The context matter, of course, and you always need to listen proactively to your body, because if you exercise in the wrong way, you may experience only side effects and no benefits. So the side effects are, of course, mild and temporary, but they can become serious complication of a natural course of neuromuscular disease when the recovery time is not taken into account, the exercise was not well selected, the intensity, the duration of the exercise is not correct. So therefore, there are a lot of attempts from different either group of experts as workshop consensus, or coming from patient advocacy groups, from neurological or other societies, from Treat-NMD. There were a lot of efforts in the past year trying to recommend the correct approach to the exercise. I think the most interesting, very, very recent data we have now available is the EMC workshop number 281 that was published a few months ago. So I would definitely recommend to download this and read this interesting consensus-based recommendation, exercise prescription and outcome measures. During the workshop, there were a session on scientific evidence on exercise prescription and current practice. Actually, they were also running an international survey for both patients and healthcare professionals, try to answer on exercise prescription and current practice, but they were also during this workshop covering outcome measures and the long-term continuation of exercise. So during I was not attending this workshop, so I cannot really say too much that is not published, but from the article, you clearly understand that based on the scientific evidence, on the survey results and the discussion our colleagues had in a Hof group, they now in this consensus paper there was a strong consensus that personalized exercise is safe and beneficial in patients with neuromuscular diseases. It is actually recommended. Recommendations were clearly formulated for the frequency, the intensity, the time, aerobic versus resistance exercise. And also, even though you cannot read anything on the other little table, they were also providing potential outcome measures to monitor the progress of the neuromuscular condition over time through either aerobic or resistance exercise, because both exercise can be definitely important for different reasons. Yeah, I mean, this is quite clear, and including the resistance exercise and training can be of beneficial impact in the neuromuscular patient. But again, mainly with resistance training, the risk of muscle damage or fatigue with overtraining, joint strain, injury should be clearly clear. So the patient should not start doing what he wants without a clear recommendation of the physician, of the physiotherapist in charge of his training. Regarding pharmacological management of fatigue, well, fatigue can arise from so many different causes. Therefore, the treatment really depends on the underlying diagnosis, on the underlying disease. There is not so far a universal drug that can be used even in physiological muscle fatigue. There were trials exploring different molecules, mainly psychotropic stimulants, but at the moment we don't really have the pill that fight and solve the muscle fatigue problem. Of course, depending on the disease, we have already multiple neuromuscular disorders, either disease-modifying treatments or symptomatic treatments that may affect positively also the fatigue. So, of course, in Pompe disease, usually not only the strength improve in our patient, but also the fatigue. In CPT deficiency, same is true for rare myopathies like riboflavin or CoQ10 responders that are quite rare, but we do have some now new treatment available for ultra rare mitochondrial myopathies that can reverse not only the progression of the muscle wasting and but also they have a very good impact on fatigue in this case, right? So it really depends on the underlying condition. So if you were attending this webinar to know which is the best pill I can use in patient with muscular fatigue, I'm afraid I don't have an answer to give you. All right, so this is my last slide. I hope in these 45 minutes I gave you an overview of fatigue as a common symptom, which is not specific of our neuromuscular field, but is a quite common condition in neurology and in medicine in general. Both central and peripheral nervous system can be involved in generating fatigue, even simultaneously. And primary or secondary causes of fatigue can be present in different neurological diseases, including our neuromuscular disorders. In order to assess fatigue, we have few outcome measures, we have few biomarkers, but we do have a lot of prompts that should be used more and more often in our daily practice. And in general, fatigue should be carefully assessed and considered, also because it's becoming more and more important, also from a regulatory perspective. The management require a multidisciplinary, individualized, integrated approach where exercise protocol and exercise-specific regimes are extremely important, can be part of the rehabilitation program, and should somehow be encouraged to our patient, but always under strict supervision to prevent risk and involuntary muscle damage. As a last point, I think that one day we should start putting the expert in one room to better understand the definition, the biomarkers, the most reliable outcome measures to approach this conundrum of fatigue. So these are all my collaboration in Italy, in Europe. This is the the university hospital team involved in our neuromuscular activities that I acknowledge, mainly Sara Loprieno today, because she was helping me a lot also with this presentation, and all the different agencies and societies that are supporting our work. Thank you, Antonio. This is the end.
No, on the contrary, I thank you, and I believe that all the attendants thank you very much for this brilliant um, exposition about a very complex and difficult topic. As usual, people are still hesitating to put questions on the chat or on the Q&A, so I will start to give a bit of encouragement to everybody. So in my view, and this is a personal view, but I think it may resonate with some other people as well, when you think of muscle weakness, you think immediately of peripheral manifestations of that. So you have some dynamometer or some way that you basically translate muscle weakness into a number. So it's easy to quantify theoretically. We know that it's not just that, and you still have the motivation and the collaboration of the patient in between the number and the variable that you're assessing, but it's a quite physical complaint, I would say. So you ask patients how many stairs they can climb, or they, etc. So when you think of muscle fatigue, usually you think of probably the patient feeling exhausted on one side and having at most some pain in the legs or something like that associated with the weakness. So it's for me, it's a much more cognitive symptom than a measurable peripheral symptom, although obviously this is a bit obviously it's not 100% accuracy. And so you have told very well the definition of fatigue. You said there was a cognitive component that you called perceived fatigue, and there was a peripheral component that would be the most amenable to assess through some kind of biometry. And my issue with the scales that you presented, for instance, the FSS that you said that you use frequently, and that is probably one of the most used in many neuromuscular diseases, is that I have some idea that it's better to assess the perceived fatigue than the objective one. And you fortunately did a very good exposition about the possible digital biomarkers of the future and some of the past, because actimetry or actigraphy is something that you have for a long time, and we already have some ideas how that correlates with the PROMs. My question is, in specific situations like mitochondrial disorders or myotonic dystrophy, we start to need to do a double jeopardy or double heavy task, because in the past we were discussing what is the best PROM for this disease or for this condition, and now probably we need to start marrying PROMs with digital biomarkers. So what's your perspective on that?
It is extremely complicated, Antonio. My experience is mainly on mitochondrial myopathies, right? And then unfortunately, we were, the study was supposed to run for 3 years, and then we got the COVID, of course. So we had to stop after 12 months of monitoring. At that time, what we have done was, first of all, we took into consideration the EMC workshop at that time available, suggesting the best PROMs and outcome measures. So because we don't know a priori which one is the best, either as a PROM or an outcome measure, the study was designed in a way that it was quite boring and long, because we were exploring 5 different functional outcome measures and 4 different PROMs. This basally at 6, 12, theoretically 18, 24 months. And then you see which one is more sensitive also to catch changes over time. And so unfortunately the study failed because of the COVID. So we have data only after 12 months. So I don't know which is the best outcome measure to use. This is one of the major challenge also, that now that I'm also discussing with the regulatory agencies or pharma companies, we don't know which is the most sensitive. Nobody knows. I don't know, maybe in Duchenne they know more, because maybe in SMA they know more, but in many other neuromuscular diseases, we don't know. That's the advantage, I think, of these new digital biomarkers, because they can not only analyze hundreds of thousands of data without any, the patient is not wasting any second of his life, of their life. But at the same time, you can deliver more PROMs that the patient can also do anytime they want at home. They don't have to stay at the hospital. They don't have to fill papers, So the future is there. It's not going to be easy to find the right way to go. We need the young generation, but the future is there.
So on the same note, we have currently one approved digital biomarker, is the stride velocity 95 percentile.
Yeah.
So do you see any role for fatigue assessment for that measurement?
Maybe yes, but until we don't have a clear definition of the fatigue, which fatigue you want to explore in which disease, I think it will fail, because at the moment, how do you select the patient based on, how do you, so it's
I was thinking of myasthenia, for instance, or neuromuscular junction.
Neuromuscular junction, probably at least you have a unique, pathomechanism of the fatigue in this cohort.
Very well. And still people are not putting questions, but if you don't want to write, you can also raise your hands. And in terms of the treatments, I think that the innovation, at least for the last 10 to 20 years, was the rehabilitation of exercise, namely because patients with neuromuscular disorders not infrequently, unfortunately, have heart problems or breathing problems or both. Exercise was not exactly something that the doctors in ancient times would think of recommending. So I know that this is a rather new way of looking at things, and that there is very good work demonstrating that if you give the right exercise at the right pace to the right patient, it will improve their quality of life. So you did a very good rule of thumbs demonstration in your presentation, all to discuss exercise with patients. Can I challenge you to, from the top of your head, tell me one or two or three pathologies or entities or groups of diseases that you think exercise can be more useful than in other groups? I don't know.
I mean, metabolic diseases probably are the ones that can benefit of the aerobic exercise. I would say so. At least my experience, and always try to explain this to my metabolic patients, definitely. But I know that also in all the genetic neuropathies now, they are developing more and more protocols that we should ask Davide Parison. But I think there is a room there also as well. We have a very long query on the chat, so maybe Antonio, I can read this.
Okay. So if Karen wants, I can unmute her and she can voice. So Karen, if you want, you can now unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen
Hi.
Chen. I'm a patient advocate as well as a member of the International Myositis Society. I just wanted to make a comment because I don't think these fatigue scales are really used in clinical practice. So your regular clinical practice, just for the reasons that you mentioned. There's no resources or, just too little clinic time to fully assess this. But with the digital possibilities nowadays, I wonder whether we could more actively do this so that patients can really help the clinical team to track, their progress or the effectiveness of drug therapies or any kind of other therapies such as exercise training, as you mentioned. So this is just a comment. It's not really a question, but I think we need to do more to really use fatigue tracking as part of our daily clinical practice.
Yeah. Thank you for your comment. I totally agree with you. I mean, in the real world, unfortunately, we don't have time to assess nothing at the end, right? Because we have 20 minutes. In these 20 minutes, we have to also fill up, at least in Italy, 20 different documents. So we don't have time. One of the reasons why we thought with the executive committee of our ERN to start thinking of the app for the patient belonging to our ERN is exactly this. Because, now if we are going to have the right prompts, the right scales in an app that the patient can easily use anytime, and with an automatic system, you can just transfer your fatigue data to the clinician and monitor also through the prompts and through the app how your rehabilitation program is changing the perception of the objectivity of the fatigue. This is a good way to go. So we really need to take advantage of these new tools, because otherwise in the clinics we will never have time. I think. I don't know, Antonio, if you agree with me.
Yeah, I think that when we are talking about scales that can be filled by the patients alone that result in patient-reported outcomes, the great solution is exactly what Michelangelo discussed during the presentation. So apps like Promi, where the patient has access to those scales and can evaluate repeatedly their status in different conditions, in different hours of the day, etc., is the future. And even if that generates large amounts of data, fortunately, we have the tools nowadays to make sense of that data and include that data into the care and monitoring of the patient. So that was exactly what I was saying to Michelangelo, and he was replying to me as well, that we need to start integrating on one side those PROs that are that the patients have the right motivation to fill, and all the other data that we get either from our clinics or even from sensors and things like that. And so we are going to a much more integrated phenotype. I agree with you, Karen. So there was a question in the chat, and Karen was very kind to offer some support about the patients with myasthenia gravis, but I think we cannot discuss individual cases in these webinars, as you understand. And it's a patient in an area in Canada where she can easily get support if she if she looks for the right counseling, either by care professionals or by patient associations like the ones from Canada. So I think we can stop by now, and I want to thank very much Michelangelo for this brilliant webinar, and wish to thank our audience and ask them to give the feedback through the form. If you don't have the form link, I left it on the chat, so you can link on the chat. And next week, we'll come back for another webinar as usual. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Michelangelo, and see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.